Shadow Hack. Chapter 961, Emperor's Goblet. Li Yunmu looked at everyone kneeling on the ground without saying a single word. They could sense that the man standing in the sky above the city was the one releasing the terrifying presence from his body. At that moment, a man quickly flew out of the ancient castle at the center of the city. He wasn't suppressed by Li Yunmu, but it was very strenuous for him to fly. "I wonder whether your sire is an envoy of Yin Emperor," he asked while trembling, afraid for his life. If he offended Li Yunmu, he would be killed on the spot. But Li Yunmu didn't like his words. Yin Emperor's envoy? Yin Emperor was itching to tear him apart limb from limb, but more than that, was he even qualified to have Li Yunmu as his envoy? Because of that, Li Yunmu waved his hand and a thread of black energy wrapped around the person who had flown out of the castle. The black energy instantly covered his entire body, and the man fell from the sky. He crashed into the ground while gasping for breath. Li Yunmu didn't kill him, just penalized him, since he still needed him for the things he was about to do. "Wake him up," Li Yunmu expressionlessly said. After hearing his words, the people nearby rushed over with healing medicine. It took a good minute for the man to slowly stand up while coughing. He was extremely weak and completely bewildered. How exactly did he offend the Lord? Why did the Lord give him such a strict punishment as soon as he approached him? Yin Emperor? Is he even capable of making me his envoy? Li Yunmu's words resounded in everyone's ears like thunder. For a moment, the entire city descended into a commotion. Who was this person who was so crazy to enter Yin Emperor's small world? But after experiencing Li Yunmu's power firsthand, no one dared to say anything. At this time, the person who had been punished understood how exactly he had offended the man in the sky, and he grew terrified. That person paused, then shot a glance at the residents kneeling on the ground because of Li Yunmu's presence. He couldn't help but summon his courage again and ask, "Lord, this lowly one has accidentally offended Lord, but I don't know why has Lord come to Yin Cloud City. Who are you?" "This lowly one is the master of Yin Cloud City, Lord. I wonder if you can remove your presence. I am afraid after another hour." Li Yunmu coldly looked at him, but scattered his presence. The people below were his future source of void origin points, so he couldn't afford to let them die. "I have come this time in order to give you a chance," Li Yunmu with an expressionless face. When the people underneath heard him, they looked at each other, not knowing what exactly was this opportunity that he was talking about. But they were extremely terrified of Li Yunmu. After all, they had all sensed the presence he had released. "I don't know what is this opportunity that Lord is talking about." Li Yunmu heard the city master's inquiry and waved his large hand to absorb all the people underneath into his heavenly world. "The opportunity to become my people from today onwards." The city master was stupefied. He knew that Li Yunmu was crazy and not afraid of Yin Emperor who ruled over them, but he did not expect that Li Yunmu would dare to snatch Yin Emperor's people. This Lord, where did they go if Lord Yin Emperor learns of this? At that moment, the city lord was panic-stricken. On one hand, he was afraid that Li Yunmu was going to kill him, but on other hand, if Yin Emperor learned of this matter, he wouldn't be able to escape responsibility either. "Do you have any other choice? I am lacking a servant here, so you'll become it," Li Yunmu said with disapproval in his voice. Even if Yin Emperor came, he had the confidence to escape unscathed. What was more, Yin Emperor was in Azura City at that moment, trying to find him. He and the other three quasi-sages hated him to bone, so they were ready to do anything to find him, but as the master of Azura City, how could Azura let them do as they please? At that moment, Li Yunmu could do as he wished. "Lord, I am a lowly city master, I fear." Due to his terror of Yin Emperor's might, the city lord tried his best to refuse Li Yunmu. After all, Yin Emperor was the chief of the small world, just like a god. "Then you will only be useful if you are dead." Li Yunmu wrinkled his brows. He was feeling extremely unhappy in his heart, and he quickly congealed the black energy to kill the man before him. Upon seeing that, the city master became extremely terrified. He suddenly understood that even if Yin Emperor was more powerful, his little life was in the hands of the stranger who stood before him. He hurried forward to beg for forgiveness. "Lord, spare my life." But before he could finish speaking, Li Yunmu's black cloud wrapped tightly around him. The city master's vitality was then instantly sapped. He was just an ant, so why would Li Yunmu give him the opportunity to beg for forgiveness? Soon after that, Li Yunmu found the deputy city master of Yin Cloud City within his heavenly world. Once the deputy city master was called out, he understood that Li Yunmu wasn't someone they could deal with. The deputy city master was an intelligent person, so once he appeared, he immediately went down on his knees. "Lord, what are your instructions? This little one will do his utmost to accomplish all you ask." Li Yunmu looked at him and indifferently said, "Explain the situation of this Ryukyu small world to me." Reporting to Lord, this Ryukyu small world has an extremely large area with numerous cities. We are considered as a fourth-grade city, so there are many more formidable cities above us. When the deputy city master saw that Li Yunmu wasn't replying, he continued after a pause. Ryukyu small world has a unique characteristic, and it is that the yin energy here is extremely profound. Because of it, almost no one goes outside at night, but naturally, that isn't important for someone like the Lord. Li Yunmu was extremely excited after hearing this information. Previously, he had understood that Ryukyu spirit world was a precious treasure with extremely profound yin energy, but Yin Emperor was only using it as a container for a small world, which was quite a waste of such a treasure. Li Yunmu had come to Ryukyu small world in order to devour Yin Emperor's void origin points and to obtain the Ryukyu spirit pearl. The system had previously told him that there was a goblet left behind by Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu which contained his life essence. What kind of character was Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu? He was a hegemon of a part of the world from ancient times, and his life essence was enough for people to enjoy it endlessly. However, not many people knew that the Ryukyu spirit pearl which Yin Emperor had obtained wasn't only a yin treasure. "Since you don't know what's what, I will take Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's goblet off your hands," Li Yunmu thought in his heart. Chapter 962, Yin Imperial Palace. After making a plan, Li Yunmu turned to the deputy city master, "Which region is the richest in yin energy in the Ryukyu small world?" The deputy city master did not hesitate to answer him. Reporting to Lord, "This lowly one doesn't know which region is the richest in yin energy. But to the south of our Yin Cloud City, there is a first-grade city. I believe that everything the Lord wants to know can be learned there." Li Yunmu faintly glanced at the deputy city master. He knew why he was told to go to the first-grade city. When he reached it, some expert there would deal with him. But the deputy city master underestimated Li Yunmu's strength. Although he could not defeat Yin Emperor, there was no one in the Ryukyu small world who could fight him. "Humph, you want me to go there and find my death?" Li Yunmu coldly snorted. He hadn't thought that the people of the Ryukyu small world would be such idiots. He then waved his hand and blasted the deputy city master out of existence without giving him any chance to say anything. After that, Li Yunmu flew toward the first-grade city just like the deputy city master had wanted. When he reached it, he saw that it wasn't a small city like Yin Cloud City. The first-grade city was extremely prosperous, with people going in and out of the city all the time. Li Yunmu wasn't very anxious to complete his objective, so he descended on the ground and slowly walked inside through the city gate. He didn't go to the city master's residence this time, but entered a small tavern and found a corner to sit down. There, he began to listen to the conversations between the visitors of the tavern. "Hey, did you hear? Yin Imperial Palace will open up after 7 days. What? It's being opened in advance this time. That's only natural. I also heard that the city master invited the elites of all cities, and even young Master Yin Xian came out of seclusion. What a pity, only those people who can cultivate to heavenly tribulation stage or higher within 100 years can enter the Yin Imperial Palace. Otherwise, people like us would get to try their luck too. When Li Yunmu heard the conversation between two men, he became extremely curious. The system, which had been silent until then, chose that moment to speak. If my guess isn't wrong, Yin Imperial Palace should be the location of the goblet. But why is the requirement of the Emperor Goblet that a person should reach heavenly tribulation stage or higher in less than 100 years? System smiled, then said disdainfully. Haha, it is possible that this is the requirement to awaken the Emperor Goblet and find a descendant. Among the immortals, the heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was an ancient sage who had proclaimed himself a hegemon. But in the end, his name only existed in the passing down of his knowledge and cultivation methods to the younger generation. Only his fame remained, but even it had diminished with time. Any small thing could result in his lineage vanishing completely. This Emperor Goblet is extremely useful for you. You may be able to use it to break through to the great principal golden immortal realm or even become a quasi-sage. Li Yunmu's eyes began to shine after hearing the system's words. He hadn't expected that the Emperor Goblet would have such formidable energy. It seemed like he had to make a trip for it. But he didn't know how he could enter Yin Imperial Palace, so he stood up and walked to the two men who had been talking earlier. He looked at the two of them and asked with a faint smile, "Hearing the two of you talk, this lowly me became extremely curious. I wonder, how does one enter the Yin Imperial Palace? Who are you? If you ask me to speak, then I will speak." Before the person could finish speaking, Li Yunmu slightly unleashed his presence, so only the two men could sense it. The speaker immediately shut his mouth in astonishment. Li Yunmu was still smiling, but there was an extremely threatening look in his eyes. After the two men felt his presence, they became afraid that he would erase them both with a wave of his hand, and one of them hurriedly spoke up. "My lord, just a moment ago this lowly one failed to recognize you. Sire must register at the city master's residence to enter the Yin Imperial Palace. Only those who have cultivated to heavenly tribulation stage or higher in less than 100 years are allowed to enter." Li Yunmu nodded, then left. The two men heaved a sigh of relief, but their clothes were already filled with cold sweat. They knew that they had narrowly escaped death, and after glancing at each other, they had a tacit understanding that they would keep the matter in their hearts and not mention it to anyone. Li Yunmu quickly went to the city master's residence. While on his way, he questioned the people of Yin Cloud City whom he had captured in his heavenly world. From them, he understood that the heavenly tribulation realm in the Ryukyu small world was roughly equivalent to the tribulation passing stage in the Night Pearl small world. Li Yunmu then decided to suppress his cultivation to the initial stage of true immortal realm. That way, he could be counted among the upper middle tier in terms of strength among the people entering the Yin Imperial Palace. What astonished Li Yunmu was that the city master's residence didn't have a strict control over who participated. After only testing his age and realm, they gave him a command tile and informed him to come in front of Yin Imperial Palace after 7 days. After that, they didn't pay him any more attention. Li Yunmu felt that Yin Imperial Palace wasn't as simple as he had imagined, so he decided to scout it out before doing anything rash. At night, he figured out the position of Yin Imperial Palace and went to visit it. When he got close to it, he was extremely astonished. The Yin Imperial Palace in front of him was an old tomb which resembled an imperial palace that had been built many years ago. The moment Li Yunmu got close to it, he could sense the pressure it emitted. Yin Imperial Palace, the 3 words written on a board were hanging high above the large stone gate and added a hint of grandiose to the old tomb. Just from looking at the old tomb, Li Yunmu could understand what kind of person Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was when he was alive. He had surprisingly established a grand tomb which resembled a palace for himself. Just when Li Yunmu wondered whether he should enter the tomb in front of him, he felt a sense of deep crisis and quickly rushed backwards. Under his gaze, more than 10 strands of yin energy transformed into long dragons and hovered where he had been standing just a moment ago. If Li Yunmu hadn't escaped in time, the yin energy dragons would have entered his body. The trouble to get them out could only be imagined easily. Li Yunmu's expression turned solemn. He realized that he couldn't force his way inside and needed to wait for 7 days to enter with the people of the city master's residence. He then quietly returned to the first-grade city and found a family inn to stay. 7 days passed in a flash, and Li Yunmu arrived in front of the Yin Imperial Palace. At that moment, a lot of people had already gathered there, and the majority of them had young faces. A middle-aged man was standing at the front and was pointing at something. If Li Yunmu did not guess wrong, then that person was the city master of the first-grade city. His eyes darted around the scene, and once he saw that the majority of people were present, he nodded to himself. Almost everyone has gathered, so prepare to set off. Chapter 963, Yin Imperial Palace opens. Under city master's orders, everyone began to move toward the Yin Imperial Palace in an orderly fashion. They stopped at the outer edge, in other words the place where Li Yunmu was attacked by the yin energy. After making inquiries, Li Yunmu learned that the city master who was leading the group had the family name of S.H.A.D.O.W, and there was someone called Ryukyu Small World's holy son S.H.A.D.O.W. He was the child of city master S.H.A.D.O.W. Li Yunmu followed the gazes of others and saw an elegant youth with pretty facial features. A servant with black clothes was standing behind him, holding a folding fan and waving it lightly. The youth gave the feeling of being extremely gentle, but Li Yunmu frowned slightly because he could sense the presence of demonic energy in him. But Li Yunmu didn't pay it much attention, because the Ryukyu small world was born from the Ryukyu spirit pearl, which was a supreme demonic treasure. It was inevitable that someone in it would be infected by demonic energy. At that moment, City Master Xiao's movement attracted Li Yunmu's attention. He suddenly threw black stones from his hand around the Yin Imperial Palace. The subordinates of the City Master who had been standing at their designated positions silently formed a large spell formation. Instantly, the Yin energy surrounding the Yin Imperial Palace was suppressed. City Master Xiao looked at the Yin energy being pushed back and nodded his head. Yin Imperial Palace is now open. Everyone seized the moment and quickly enter. When the youths heard that, they rejoiced in their hearts and rushed forward with their eyes shining brightly. They wanted to seize the key moment and collect the treasures for themselves. But Li Yunmu didn't move. He was not alone in that too. The youths who had strong backing and Holy Son Xia Rong also stayed behind. Li Yunmu came to a quick decision then that the youths rushing forth were people who came from ordinary backgrounds or were disciples of the clans which had declined greatly. When the youth in the lead stepped inside the stone gate of the Yin Imperial Palace, the smile on his face disappeared. Just a moment ago, his speed had been extremely fast but at that moment, his expression changed to that of alarm. An enormous energy tried to enter his body. That energy quickly drilled into his skin and rushed into his danshan, from where it began to spread through his whole body. It was self-detonation. The people behind him sensed that something wasn't right. They could see the change in the youth in the front and noticed his presence becoming unstable. All the young talents with comparatively faster speeds were also in a similar situation. Their expressions became unsightly one by one, and their bodies swelled despite them trying their utmost to control it. But even Li Yunmu would have to spend a large amount of experience points to control it, so how could the young talents who had barely reached tribulation passing stage suppress it forcefully? An explosion rang out in the air where the body of the young talent burst apart. The plants surrounding him instantly turned to ashes, and he dropped on top of them in a pile of burnt black meat. That young talent's explosion was like a signal. All the youths whose bodies had been invaded by the yin energy began to explode one by one. For a while, blood and meat flew around in all directions. The reek of blood slowly spread throughout the air, and Li Yunmu, who stood on the side, began to frown. It seemed like Yin Imperial Palace wasn't that simple. The young talents whose body hadn't been invaded were shaking in fear. The men of different clans had rushed to enter the palace, but they discovered that the yin energy which had been suppressed until then rushed out once more. It took the shape of a long dragon and shot toward the group of young talents. Its powerful presence, which could create spatial cracks, made all of them panic. They unleashed their most powerful attacks, attempting to resist the dragon formed of yin energy, but they could only despair. The long dragon formed of yin energy broke through their attacks and continued flying toward them. Under the despaired gazes of the young talents, the yin energy dragon entered their bodies, and before long, their situation became similar to that of the youths who had rushed in first. One by one, all of them exploded and turned into piles of blood and flesh. When all the young talents who had entered the Yin Imperial Palace were wiped out, City Master S.H.A.D.O.W nodded in satisfaction. He extended his hand, then sensed the thick smell of blood in the surrounding and said with an indifferent expression, "All right, the great spell has started. We can enter now." Li Yunmu's eyebrows jumped. For the opening of the Yin Imperial Palace, the majority of the young talents of Ryukyu's small world had been summoned. It was quite unexpected then that the method City Master S.H.A.D.O.W used for opening the Yin Imperial Palace would instantly cause the deaths of almost 70% of the youths present. Li Yunmu couldn't help but feel somewhat sorrowful. Those people were the future source of space elements for him. He hadn't expected that City Master S.H.A.D.O.W would be so ruthless and wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice so many young talents to achieve his aim. Li Yunmu was shocked by it and sentenced City Master S.H.A.D.O.W to death. But even though he could be killed with a wave of a hand, Li Yunmu did not attack right away. The Emperor's goblet had a higher priority. He was afraid that there were still some restrictions in the Yin Imperial Palace, for which City Master S.H.A.D.O.W, who had much more knowledge about it, would become necessary. Li Yunmu could be considered as unparalleled in the Ryukyu small world, but when all was said and done, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was an existence of ancient times. So in order to reduce the consumption of experience points, Li Yunmu intended to listen to City Master S.H.A.D.O.W for a time being. What the City Master gave a second go-ahead, the remaining young talents released astonishing presences and rushed to Yin Imperial Palace. Li Yunmu saw that S.H.A.D.O.W was also rushing forward, so it seemed like there were no problems left. City Master S.H.A.D.O.W shouldn't be as malicious as to get his own son killed. Because of that, Li Yunmu also followed behind them. When he entered the stone gate, the people rushing in front of him had already disappeared. He carefully observed the interior part of Yin Imperial Palace. There was a long passage in front of him. Its walls were made of thick blue stones and were extremely glossy. There were lamps placed on both sides of the wall. Their flames were blue, which made them somewhat cold and gloomy, but they were extremely bright. The 2 rows of lamps extended in the front as far as Li Yunmu could see. He kept walking for a few hours, but still didn't see any of the young talents who had entered before him despite walking the same passage. After realizing that, Li Yunmu began to frown. He felt that Yin Imperial Palace was truly extraordinary. Even with his strength, he couldn't sense the ending of the passage. Chapter 964, Space-Time Spirit. Although Li Yunmu's speed wasn't very fast at that moment, given the cultivation difference between him and the other young talents, even if he wasn't intentionally rushing and continued at a leisurely pace, the others couldn't catch up to him, much less come in contact with him. Pay attention, this maze isn't simple. At that moment, the system dropped a line indifferently and turned silent. After Li Yunmu heard the warning, he wanted to inquire about some things, but the system ignored him, so he also didn't continue. Li Yunmu continued advancing forward. Since he didn't know anything about the maze, he could only continue going forward. While doing that, he fully released his divine sense to detect any transformation in the maze. Sure enough, he couldn't underestimate the Yin Imperial Palace. Just as he entered, he fell into a formidable trap. It seemed like he would have to pay full attention on the path forward. After Li Yunmu advanced for some more time, a distortion in space appeared. The surrounding environment, which had been completely calm until then, suddenly filled with a reek of blood. It was very strange, but what caught Li Yunmu's attention was a sharp killing intent that permeated the air and was coming toward him. Upon sensing the tremendous change in environment, he became even more vigilant. He once again told himself that the place wasn't simple and began to survey his surroundings cautiously. Sure enough, the killing intent sensed by Li Yunmu attacked him from the back and aimed in the middle of his spine. Humph, trying to be a smartass. Li Yunmu coldly snorted. His figure shook once, and a powerful force suddenly erupted, shattering the attack coming toward his back. Soon after, a figure was jolted out of the void. It had a small body, like that of a child. Its upper body was naked and covered in tattoos while there was a strange mask on his face. In his hand, a dagger flickered like it was made of ice. Judging from the shine of the dagger, it was clearly covered in poison. The creature shrieked miserably. Its voice was extremely sharp, and Li Yunmu's mind trembled slightly. After that, the creature slashed in front of it with the dagger and created a spatial crack. Its figure flickered, about to disappear in it, but how could Li Yunmu let it run? He grabbed the creature within the void and crushed the spatial crack. Once it was gone, the creature came out of it fully. After it was thrown on the ground, it spat out purple-black blood and looked at Li Yunmu viciously. Eh? How can this space-time spirit appear here? The system asked in astonishment in Li Yunmu's head. Space-time spirit? What's that? After hearing the unfamiliar term, Li Yunmu became curious and asked about it. This space-time spirit is a special species existing in this world. They possess an innate affinity with spatial energy and can easily open spatial cracks to freely travel between different worlds, the system explained. Then why was it trying to assassinate me? Li Yunmu couldn't understand why the space-time spirit had tried to sneak attack him. According to reason, there shouldn't be any enmity between the two of them. I don't know, that the system said indifferently. After that, regardless of how much Li Yunmu called for it, it didn't answer. Li Yunmu was left somewhat speechless, but after looking at the space-time spirit in front of him, he could not understand how to deal with it. He couldn't just put it inside the heavenly world. Once it woke up, it would just leave. But there was no need to kill it either. Li Yunmu didn't find it necessary to become enemies with the strange creature. While he thought about his options, the space-time spirit lying on the ground stood up. It chanted out some spell in an incoherent voice, and an enormous spatial crack appeared in front of it. After that, its body flickered and disappeared into the crack. Keep pace with him, the system ordered. After Li Yunmu heard it, his figure flickered, and he entered the crack. Once he came out, the space-time spirit had already disappeared, but Li Yunmu found himself in a different place. He observed his surroundings and confirmed that he was still within the Yin Imperial Palace. However, he had left the strange passage. At that moment, Li Yunmu was standing in an enormous stone room. Once he surveyed his surroundings, he discovered an enormous sword in the middle of the stone room. Half of it was buried inside the ground while the hilt of the sword was tightly bound by 4 iron chains. The ends of the 4 iron chains were all within enormous balls of light. Li Yunmu observed them carefully, then involuntarily took a deep breath. The 4 balls of light were formed from the light emitted by ocean monarch stones, which were the size of a human head. Even in the origin world, a single palm-sized ocean monarch stone could make numerous powers fight over it, so Li Yunmu hadn't expected that he would surprisingly find 4 of them, and ones which were so much larger. The ocean monarch stones didn't have many special characteristics. First, they provided immunity against soul attacks, and second, they provided immunity against water-attributed martial skills. But just these 2 characteristics were enough to show its strength. It was said that if anyone possessed sufficient ocean monarch stones, they could even comprehend water-attributed laws. What were laws? Even Emperor Realm powerhouses didn't have the qualifications to comprehend them. Only after breaking through the Emperor Realm and attaining the Sovereign Realm could they possess the qualifications to comprehend them. A sovereign could wipe 100 emperors out of existence with just a wave of his hand. 5 emperor came out of 100 immortals, and 3 sovereigns came out of 100 emperors. Why was it difficult to attain the Sovereign Realm? It was because of people's inability to sense the existence of laws and comprehend them. All emperor-level powerhouses wanted to take things one step further, but they could not. But if they possessed Ocean Monarch stones, they could begin to comprehend the laws. After they reached the great circle of the Emperor realm, they could step into the Sovereign realm. Because of that heaven-defying effect, Ocean Monarch stones were considered extremely precious. But Li Yunmu didn't let profit cloud his eyes. The 4 Ocean Monarch stones, which were the size of human heads, were suppressing something, so how terrifying was that object? Li Yunmu walked forward and began to inspect the enormous sword. There was an enormous stone tablet in front of it. There were a few words written at the front. I had accidentally obtained this sword, but I couldn't take control of the sinister energy inside it. By the time I discovered this, it was already too late. Chapter 965, Solitary Ignition Sword. Li Yunmu's heart was filled with raging waves. If even an Emperor Realm expert had been unable to control the sword, there could only be one explanation, and it was that the sword was unexpectedly a sovereign weapon. Li Yunmu continued reading then. This sword is known as the Solitary Ignition Sword, and it contains a demonic spirit. If the sealed demonic spirit comes out, heaven and earth will be thrown into complete chaos. If any one of the future generations come here, you mustn't harbor any evil thoughts in your heart. Otherwise, your soul will be dominated by the demonic spirit and the world will definitely suffer a calamity. Don't forget that. Li Yunmu looked at the writing on the stone tablet, finally understanding why 4 Ocean Monarch stones were used to suppress the sword. If a sovereign-level demonic weapon was released, no one in the world would be an opponent for it. But Li Yunmu was extremely interested in the sword. Not only it, but also the Ocean Monarch stones. And even the iron chains were not normal. After a careful examination, he realized that they were created from meteoric iron. System, could I control this sword? Li Yunmu calmed his thoughts. Regardless of how many experience points and space elements were required, or even if all of them were used up, as long as he could obtain those things, everything would be worth it. You cannot. You only possess the strength of Great Principle Golden Immortal, and yet you want to control a sovereign weapon, the system coldly asked, pouring cold water over Li Yunmu's imagination. When he heard the system's reply, he couldn't help but feel despair. But since he couldn't control it, then he didn't intend to come in contact with it. Even if he didn't care about others, he didn't desire to release a sovereign weapon which couldn't be controlled. But if you agree to invest a sufficient amount of experience points and space elements, then it can be considered. The system's voice resounded again, sending Li Yunmu's mood, which had touched the depths of abyss, directly to heaven. Why didn't you say so earlier? Li Yunmu hatefully said to the system. What, you have some problem? Bite me. The system sneered at him. It had actually done it for the good of him. Li Yunmu had become somewhat arrogant, even thinking about controlling a sovereign weapon. It wasn't a good idea, so it chose to pour some cold water over him to make him wake up and remind him that the disparity between realms couldn't be overcome so easily. Li Yunmu also understood that the system had done it for his good, so he didn't say anything about it. After examining the sword again and again, he extended his hand toward the hilt, but a voice interrupted him. Stay your hand. Li Yunmu turned in the direction of the voice and saw that a large door had opened at some point in time. A person was standing in the doorway, and it was the first holy son of the Ryukyu small world, S.H.A.D.W. S.H.A.D.W's ego could be considered to have swelled infinitely. After he entered the Yin Imperial Palace, he didn't fall into a trap like Li Yunmu, and his path had been completely smooth. He was able to collect many things inside the Yin Imperial Palace, like cultivation methods, elixirs, and materials. All of them went into his pockets. While moving forward, he also came across many young talents, whom he coerced into dual cultivation with him and turned them into his slaves. After that, he reached the stone room in which Li Yunmu was present. Because Li Yunmu had luckily stumbled into the stone room through the spatial crack created by space-time spirit, the restriction in front of the stone room had disappeared. Otherwise, given S.H.A.D.Ow's strength, his body would have immediately self-detonated once he came in contact with the stone door. In that sense, S.H.A.D.O.W was much luckier than Li Yunmu. After arriving at the stone room, S.H.A.D.O.W saw the enormous sword stuck in the ground as well as the ocean monarch stones surrounding it. Although he didn't know what they were, one didn't even need to think about the things in Yin Imperial Palace, since all of them were precious treasures. Everything here belongs to me. You can get lost. S.H.A.D.O.W looked at Li Yunmu with a proud and aloof expression, like the first holy son of Ryukyu's small world should. If anyone else had been there, he indeed would have the capital to be arrogant, but unfortunately for him, the person he had come in contact with was not another young talent. Li Yunmu narrowed his eyes and shot a black beam toward the intruder. It shocked S.H.A.D.O.W. The first holy son was completely gobsmacked by the fact the person in front of him would dare to attack him. He then raised his hand to crush the reckless ant in front of him, but just as he was about to attack, his expression changed completely. He had sensed the strength of Li Yunmu's attack. In a moment of desperation, he hastily took out a charm from his chest pocket and crushed it. Then, a golden shield enveloped him. Li Yunmu's black beam covered the protective shield from top to bottom. Although S.H.A.D.O.W wasn't injured, his protective shield was completely surrounded by the black beam, which allowed him to sense Li Yunmu's might. How could he have known that the person in front of him would surprisingly be so formidable? While he thought about that, a crack appeared on the protective shield, and his expression fell. Fortunately for him, when the protective shield shattered, the black beam's energy was completely exhausted. S.H.A.D.O.W heaved a sigh of relief after seeing that, but a hint of lingering fear was still in his heart. If he hadn't obtained 2 defensive charms the last time he entered Yin Imperial Palace, he would have turned into a corpse at that moment. His father had told him that the charm was unparalleled in the world, so how did it shatter from the attack? Did his luck finally run out? But when he looked at the things in the stone room, he could sense the enormous energy fluctuations coming out from them. It was clear that all the treasures before him were heaven-defying existences, unlike those he previously obtained. He was unwilling to leave empty-handed, so he squinted his eyes and said, "This day, oh friend, it was my mistake just a moment ago, so I've been thinking. You see these women behind me? You can take whoever you fancy among them." Li Yunmu looked up at him with a ridicule on his face at that moment. That guy was really not anything good. When the women standing behind him heard what was said, their complexion turned pale. They had all come to look for opportunities, but they hadn't expected that they would be traded like livestock. Yet they knew that the cultivation world was cruel. The strong preyed on the weak, and only those with formidable strength could live properly. When S.H.A.D.O.W saw that Li Yunmu wasn't saying anything, he thought that he was moved by his proposal. His smile became even wider, and he said, "But Deo friend, after you take them, the things in this room will belong to me." Li Yunmu didn't say anything nor show any expression. He didn't intend to talk with an ant, and he erupted with a powerful presence before rushing to attack S.H.A.D.O.W. Chapter 966, An Ancient Secret. At that moment, S.H.A.D.O.W was thinking that he had already dealt with Li Yunmu and was busy looking at the ocean monarch stones. He could feel an enormous amount of energy accumulated within them. Out of nowhere then, he sensed a ferocious hostile intent coming toward him. He turned around and saw a long black dragon rushing straight at him. On top of that, its presence was even more formidable compared to that of the previous attack. It hadn't even crossed S.H.A.D.O.W's mind that after he offered such beneficial conditions and even agreed to share his women that the youngster wouldn't appreciate his kindness. When they left, he had to ask his father to turn the unfamiliar youth into mincemeat. While he was thinking about it, he took out another charm, which was identical to the previous one. It was quickly destroyed and formed a golden shield around him. S.H.A.D.O.W's heart was aching badly. On the last trip to Yin Imperial Palace, he had obtained 3 charms in total. He had used one of them previously, and now that he came in contact with the unknown youth, he was forced to use the remaining 2 charms. His hatred for Li Yunmyu became even deeper as the attack hit his defensive shield and dissipated like before. Li Yunmyu had planned to launch another attack after that, but he hadn't expected that the first holy son would spring away like a rabbit and escape suddenly, leaving behind the women he had brought with him. At that moment, they all turned deathly pale and looked at Li Yunmyu with frightened expressions. Even the first holy son of Ryukyu's small world wasn't his opponent, so what could they do? They were afraid that Li Yunmyu would casually dispose of them, and one of the women knelt on the ground and kowtowed while trembling. "Lord, please don't kill me. I am willing to serve Lord for eternity." When the other women saw this, they also followed suit. Li Yunmyu looked at them and saw that all of them were in the heavenly tribulation realm, but they were ready to turn into his property to save their lives. It was the cruelty of the cultivation world. "Stand up. I am not interested in your bodies. Do you all want revenge though?" Li Yunmyu naturally wouldn't be interested in ordinary oil and common powder, but he could collect them into his heavenly world. The women looked at each other, not understanding the meaning of revenge which he had mentioned. But in order to live, they hurriedly said, "I am willing." Li Yunmyu faintly smiled and waved his hand to collect them into his heavenly world. Then, he also entered inside and arranged for the women to stay by the side of the box in which the gods were imprisoned. The women could sense a powerful might from the imprisoned people. Their expressions changed again, since they hadn't expected that Li Yunmyu would be so formidable that he could capture such powerful people. After seeing that, the women abandoned all the small schemes they had thought to use. They realized that even if they cultivated for a lifetime, they wouldn't be able to fight Li Yunmyu. Once they sincerely surrendered, Li Yunmyu said, "You all cultivate here, in my world. After some time, Xiaorong will join you. Until then, you can think about how you are going to take your revenge. This lowly one understands." Soon after, Li Yunmyu retreated from the heavenly world. He then returned to the solitary ignition sword. He went along the chains and collected the ocean monarch stones into his heavenly world, then examined the 4 iron chains and collected them as well. The solitary ignition sword, which wasn't being subdued anymore, began to tremble at that moment. It also released a heaven-defying killing intent. Li Yunmyu felt that the sword spirit was about to awaken, so he hurriedly took hold of the sword hilt. Gloom, vengeance, and killing intent rushed into his mind, but a brilliant radiance erupted from his body at the same time, as his experience points and space elements were sapped away to resist the sword spirit. The sword spirit was a very famous crown prince Chongqing, who was the son of fire god Zhurong. He had gone to Buzhu Mountain to capture the black dragon, but was betrayed by his close friend water snake Jianyu. "Forgetting my kindness and causing the Buzhu Mountain to collapse, you stole my immortal status and partitioned my soul, which I can't forgive. If I get the opportunity, I will definitely take revenge." Although the resentment of the sword spirit was suppressed by the system, it continued howling in Li Yunmyu's mind. However, he continued pouring in experience points and space elements until it was sealed again. Once it was over, it left behind its experiences of a lifetime together with its resentment in Li Yunmyu's mind. Li Yunmyu closed his eyes and digested Chongqing's experiences. In the end, he shook his head. The spirit could be considered a pitiful person, so since it had to follow Li Yunmyu, he would certainly get revenge for Chongqing if he ever got the opportunity. A voice echoed in Li Yunmyu's mind. Article obtained, Solitary Ignition Sword, sealed. Grade, SSS. Ability, Solitary Ignition Baleful Energy, Devil Burning Epoch, sealed. Note, this sword is extremely formidable. Only remove the seal after host's strength has reached the corresponding level. I hadn't expected that you would be able to obtain it, the system said in astonishment. What's the deal with this sword? Li Yunmyu asked the system after some thought. Truthfully speaking, I also don't know, the system said helplessly. Don't tell me, there's really something you don't know? This sword spirit is called Chongqin, and he is the son of God of Fire. But Zhurong was only a trifling ancient god, so why is he known as a god of ancient times? Furthermore, how did this sword become a sovereign weapon? All of a sudden, many questions appeared in Li Yunmu's heart. He had killed the fire god and even his master Nuwa with his own hands. So why when the soul of Zhurong's son was poured into a weapon, that weapon became so formidable? The progression of events left Li Yunmu completely puzzled. That Zhurong was only a creature like your shadows, a projection. The true god of fire was much more formidable compared to Zhurong. Li Yunmu was stunned. Was there another Zhurong in the world? Then how many Nuwas were there? What about Fuxi? Furthermore, what about the primordial god world destroyed by him? The system knew that Li Yunmu wouldn't be able to accept it, but when all was said and done, it was an ancient secret. The number of people who knew it could be counted on one hand. The system paused for a moment, then continued, the real primordial god world isn't in this star field, and the people of that place are existences comparable to me and some are even more formidable than me. Hiss! Li Yunmu felt a chill run down his spine. The system had given him a great surprise. He hadn't expected that it would say something like that after suffering untold hardships, what he destroyed was only the projection of the primordial god world and nothing more. I will not tell you anything more than you should now. They aren't people whom you can come in contact with for now. Li Yunmu sneered at that. Then when will I be able? After I become an emperor? Or a sovereign? When the time comes, I will naturally tell you. Also, I am somewhat tired now. Don't call me before you find the Emperor's goblet, the system said. It knew that the matter left Li Yunmu in shock, but it could not be changed. When he thought he had reached the peak, it came and told him, "Congratulations for becoming an ant." How could he not be angered by something like that? So the system had to give him some time to calm himself. Chapter 967, Moment of Enlightenment. Li Yunmu felt completely abysmal at that moment. He had believed that the system was the most formidable existence, but there actually existed many formidable existences similar to it in the world. What made him feel the most tired, however, was that he had been walking his path for a long time already. He was pushed by one matter after another, and from a helpless ordinary person, he had come to be a formidable existence. But from the start to end, he had never seen the end of his path. Then why was he still continuing cultivation? Even if he cultivated and became a powerhouse like the system, what would happen then? What about the existences more powerful than the system? Would he still have to continue cultivating to catch up to them? At that moment, Li Yunmu's heart was in complete chaos. He suddenly realized that he didn't have any goal and was being pulled like a puppet by someone. He hadn't wanted this sort of life, but he was only a loser without any far-reaching goals and ambitions before he obtained the system. All he had wished for at that time was to not be a chess piece for others. Right now though, he felt that living as an ordinary person was very good. While thinking about it, Li Yunmu sat down cross-legged and restrained his presence completely. At that moment, he had encountered the first threshold in his cultivation journey and he couldn't just rush past it. Li Yunmu sat in a meditative state like an old monk until dust collected on his shoulders and head, but he didn't even brush them away. He was like a statue, completely motionless. His thoughts became slower, and he stopped thinking about everything. All he wanted right then was to continue sitting like he was, for he felt very comfortable at that moment. With him in that state, half a year passed in a flash. By then, Li Yunmu's body was already covered by a deep layer of dust, and the young talents who had entered the Yin Imperial Palace had withdrawn a long time ago. None of them remembered the unremarkable youth who had entered the place together with them. Stupid! You are beyond cure. When the system's cold voice resounded in Li Yunmu's brain, his eyelashes flickered, and dust fell off them. He slowly opened his eyes. During the whole half a year, he hadn't done anything. He just put away all other matters from his mind and recalled everything from the beginning. It made him realize that he had really become tired over the years. He recalled the joy when he first obtained the system, remembered his first shadow Li Yun, and the days of the school. He remembered the people he met during the journey and also remembered his mom and dad as well as older sister. Why you calling me stupid? I'm feeling extremely comfortable right now. Li Yunmu took a deep breath and his body trembled, which threw the dust away. He then shook his head to relax his stiff neck. The system sighed. When it had told Li Yunmu about things that were beyond him, it was certain that Li Yunmu would fall into a loop, but it hadn't expected that he would remain trapped for so long. The system knew that Li Yunmu had been walking on a knife's edge throughout the years, experiencing countless crises and tribulations as well as being ridiculed by countless people. He had to go through many things to reach his level. But Li Yunmu lacked one thing, and that was the spirit of a powerhouse. He needed a lofty heart to obtain his ideals, be unafraid to sail against the currents and face difficulties. If heavens obstruct me, then I will destroy them. If earth tricks me, then I will break it open. It was the mentality that a powerhouse should possess. No person who was able to become an almighty did not possess a staunch resolve and heaven-defying life. But Li Yunmu, who was born in an ordinary family, didn't have this sort of thinking. Ever since Earth experienced the Dark Ages, a fixed thinking had become deep-rooted in its people. Only those with formidable bloodline could become powerhouse, and only those who became powerhouses could have a good life. And Li Yunmu, who was an ordinary person previously, felt that he was an ordinary person who wouldn't be able to stand out among his peers. Thus, the mentality of a powerhouse was deeply buried at the bottom of his heart and never seen. The system had informed him about the matter of ancient times in hopes that he could see the light of day and reach the glory of days long past. Li Yunmu possessed the bloodline of an ancient war saint, so how could the system be willing to watch blankly as this bloodline fell into oblivion? Therefore, it deliberately told Li Yunmu about things he should not know to put some pressure on him. It should have aroused his fighting spirit and desire to surpass those ancient existences, so he would put even more effort into cultivation. But what caught the system unprepared was that Li Yunmu's inferiority complex was extremely great. He and his father had been completely ordinary, so after Li Yunmu obtained the system, he crazily drew on its support to achieve the life he wanted. But a voice echoed again and again in his heart, and it said that if he didn't possess the system, he would be nothing, just a loser bullied by everyone. So when Li Yunmu heard that there were surprisingly many existences at the same level as the system, he did not feel resentful. Instead, he became scared. He was afraid of losing, afraid that he wouldn't be able to defeat those people and might even be killed. Because of that, he sealed himself for half a year. If the system didn't call on him, he would have remained with his mind shut off for even longer. But the system couldn't continue watching Li Yunmu being so depressed. It chose to sneer at him then and said, "A few trifling existences from the ancient past have terrified you to this extent? It seems like your achievements will stop here." Li Yunmu didn't reply. He stood up and began to move his hand and feet. After staying in the stone room for half a year, his limbs had become rigid. When the system saw that Li Yunmu wasn't replying, it felt resentful and roared angrily, "You are a coward. Do you know why those ancient existences have been dormant for so many years and why I ended up with this type of body? What does that have to do with me?" Li Yunmu coldly said. The system was about to rain abuses on Li Yunmu when it heard him speak with anger in his voice. "Some existences from ancient times? I am a man, so how could I be afraid of them? If they provoke me, then I will wipe them out." "You figured it out?" the system asked blankly. "What is there to understand?" Li Yunmu asked rhetorically. "Don't these creatures of ancient times possess a body of blood and flesh? Don't they die? Then what's there to understand?" His continuous questions left the system dumbstruck. "I was born as an ordinary person, yet there are so many powerhouses afraid of me right now. So what do those ancient existences count as? I, Li Yunmu, will tell you now that only I can become the true master of the heavens. After those words, Li Yunmu's presence exploded, creating an enormous shockwave which formed a vacuum. Within half a year, Li Yunmu's mentality of a powerhouse had been roused, and his strength had advanced to the next level. Such latent potential was extremely terrifying. Chapter 968, Space-Time Spirit appears again. At that moment, Li Yunmu, regardless of whether in terms of presence, mental state, or temperament, was completely different from the Li Yunmu who had entered the Yin Imperial Palace. "Let's go, and don't leave any traces," he said indifferently. "If we get an opportunity in the future to see your enemy, I will help you wipe them out. But, of course, I would prefer a different method, and that is to let you personally settle this grudge." The system looked at Li Yunmu with a blank expression. After sensing the change in his temperament, it felt extremely moved. Sure enough, he hadn't chosen the wrong person. The descendants of a war saint couldn't be trifled with. Li Yunmu stood up and picked up the solitary ignition sword inserted in the ground and lightly brandished it. One after another, waves of sword energy were released with each slice through the air. They left sharp cuts on the walls of the stone room. "Pretty good. This is a good sword. Oi, Chongqing, since you are my sword spirit, I will help you deal with your enemies. Since I killed that Zhurong once, I can kill him again and again regardless of whoever he is, he will still die in the end." The solitary ignition sword trembled slightly, as if replying to Li Yunmu, but because it was sealed by the system, Li Yunmu couldn't understand its intentions. However, the hand which held the sword had to exert a little more strength to control it. Li Yunmu's gaze became even brighter. With a brilliant light flickering in his eyes, he appeared even more extraordinary. At that moment, his next goal was to obtain the Emperor's goblet which was in the Yin Imperial Palace. If he could obtain the inheritance of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu and ingest it properly, then even Ashura would become much weaker than him. Fortunately for him, although the Yin Imperial Palace had already been sealed, there wasn't the least bit of Yin energy present inside, otherwise, Li Yunmu would have found it quite troublesome to move around. When he came out of the stone room, he discovered the marks of battle on the walls of Yin Imperial Palace. It seemed like there were many battles between the young talents for the resources. But that did not concern Li Yunmu. It was a rule in the cultivation world that the weak would be consumed by the strong. Unless one exerted great effort, they could only be eaten up by others. Li Yunmu looked at the surroundings and confirmed that there wasn't any Yin energy around him. The atmosphere was somewhat miserable, but there were many paths outside the stone room. So many actually, that Li Yunmu had no idea which one to take for some time. "It doesn't matter, just take any path. Regardless of which one you take, all of them will converge in the Ryukyu Hall," the system said. Li Yunmu nodded, then chose a narrow path by relying on his instincts and began to walk forward. On his way, he saw many elixirs and forging materials which would be considered precious in the outside world lying around, and he collected all of them into his heavenly world. Although those things could only be considered as something that occupied space compared to the ocean monarch stones, they would be in great demand among the people residing in his heavenly world. Many people used up a large amount of credit points to obtain the things he collected, and he nodded in satisfaction after seeing that. At that moment, his heavenly world's strength was almost comparable to that of the Night Pearl small world, which he had visited previously. It was something he hadn't noticed for a while because he usually didn't pay much attention to the matters of his heavenly world. But when he investigated it this time, he was quite pleasantly surprised, because among his people, he could see many cultivators having already reached the tribulation passing stage. Li Yunmu felt extremely gratified by that. He was convinced that as long as he gave them more time, they would become his biggest helpers. Li Yunmu then resolved to help the people in his heavenly world mature at an even faster speed. Thus, as he continued advancing, he collected everything he saw. Even the soil on which the rare herbs grew was put into his heavenly world. At that moment, Li Yunmu was like a bandit, looting everything he saw. He put all of it into his heavenly world, and he even pried open the bricks of the walls under the disdainful gaze of the system. Soon, he reached the end of the passage, which had given him a lot of treasures. Regardless of whatever it was, as long as he could get his hands on it, he had collected all of it. An imposing palace appeared in front of Li Yunmu's gaze. It had a black roof and green tiles, which emitted strands of cold and gloomy intent. The large door of the palace hall was tightly shut, which made Li Yunmu extremely suspicious. Has no one entered this palace? Didn't the system say that all paths converge here? Then why does it seem like no one entered here? Li Yunmu entered the palace hall while full of suspicion. Once inside, he saw an extremely spacious hall. The floor was built with white jade tiles, while blue-colored torches were lined up along the walls. They created a gloomy atmosphere. Li Yunmu slowly walked forward with vigilance. The hall was extremely strange. It was impossible that all of the young talents would have been unable to reach it. Yet all of them had mysteriously disappeared. They could have just left the Yin Imperial Palace, but Li Yunmu didn't believe it, so he was extremely guarded against the strange palace hall. Just as he expected, he hadn't even walked 2 steps when a sharp blade of Yin energy shot toward him. Li Yunmu didn't move. He only hardened his gaze and shattered the blade. But his action was similar to blowing a fuse. In an instant, countless sharp blades congealed in the space above him and attacked him one after another. Humph! Cheap tricks, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Your cheap methods can only go so far. Li Yunmu coldly snorted, and his presence erupted. After barely an instant, all the swords shattered. They turned back into Yin energy and fell to the ground. But Li Yunmu didn't lower his guard. If an ancient sage could only use such cheap tricks, it would make no sense. When Li Yunmu took a few more steps, he suddenly felt his surroundings change, and a familiar presence reached him. Soon after, 5 spatial cracks appeared around him. 5 illusory figures stepped out and launched an intense attack on him. 5 daggers sealed Li Yunmu's retreat like 5 vipers. The 5 creatures who used them were the space-time spirits with which Li Yunmu had previously come in contact. If the cultivators of Ryukyu's small world faced the space-time spirits, then given their strength, they would be in extreme danger. Since the space-time spirits were the strangest assassins of the universe, anyone who did not possess strength far surpassing theirs would not be able to sense their sneak attack. Chapter 969, Spirit Refining Spell. Li Yunmu was different, however. He was a great principal golden immortal powerhouse for a long time, so how could he not sense their presence? But even if he let their daggers reach his body, he wouldn't be injured in the slightest. It was because of the restriction on the space-time spirits. In every generation, only one of them could break through the tribulation passing stage and enter the immortal realm. That person would then become the leader of that generation. Li Yunmu soon discovered that one of the 5 space-time spirits attacking him was injured. It should be the one who had tried to take him down previously. It was quite a surprise that instead of escaping from the Yin Imperial Palace, it called its companions and continued to sneak attack young talents. Apparently, the space-time spirits had some deep and mysterious connection with Ryukyu Sage. At that moment, Li Yunmu could clearly sense the killing intent in the eyes of the space-time spirits. Their daggers wanted to taste his blood as soon as possible. Li Yunmu's body jolted when his powerful presence erupted. Instantly, the 5 space-time spirits were blown away as if they had been struck by a hammer. They coughed out mouthfuls of blood and were unable to stand up, but he could still sense their weak breath. Li Yunmu didn't intend to take their lives, so he hadn't attacked using black energy. He was extremely curious why the space-time spirits had pledged their lives to defend the palace hall. When Li Yunmu took a few more steps and stepped out of the hall, a strong smell of blood came from behind him. That's right, it came from behind him. When he turned around to take a look, the hall had changed completely. The sight of it filled his heart with endless resentment. Countless mangled corpses lay in the hall. The blood of the majority of them had already been drained, leaving behind only dried body parts lying on the ground. After seeing that, Li Yunmu finally understood what had happened to the young talents who had come to Ryukyu Palace Hall. Their deaths were related to the space-time spirits. Li Yunmu took a cursory glance over the whole area and discovered that the blood was flowing through specific grooves on the ground. They created a large spell. This is Spirit Refining Spell. Li Yunmu recognized the large spell and its purpose. The Spirit Refining Spell was one of the few true spells created by the ancient spell race. It had only one use, and it used the souls of other people to replenish the soul of the spellcaster, thus reinforcing their spirit. It seems like Ryukyu Sage still hasn't given up. His willpower is great, but what's the use of it? All struggle is futile, Li Yunmu said indifferently. At that moment, he also understood the use of Yin Imperial Palace. What Supreme Yin attributes treasure, what countless treasures, all of them were only bait to attract people. Li Yunmu hadn't expected that the Grand Ryukyu Sage who had such great reputation and died to suppress evil with his own body, which would save the world, would actually be someone thirsty for power. In the ancient times, immortals were like dogs, emperors were present everywhere, while big S.H.A.D.W like sovereigns illuminated the heavens. It was an unprecedentedly glorious time for the world, based on a few remaining records. But a great change had happened in the world at that time. A person called Yin Devil Sovereign appeared in the world. No one knew where he came from, but wherever he went, he massacred people, which gave rise to a crisis. Yin Devil Sovereign was extremely powerful, so almost all the emperors and sovereigns went to duel with him, which lasted for several years. In the end, Yin Devil Sovereign died, but many powerhouses also perished with him. Afterwards, the sovereigns were completely wiped out, and the essence of the world was greatly ruined. The world fell into a state of crisis. Almost every region's experts had perished in that battle, but after Yin Devil Sovereign was exterminated, the Supreme Yin Sovereign Pearl, which was his supreme treasure, fell into the world. The instant this treasure emitting formidable yin energy descended, its yin energy enveloped the entire land, causing the world to degrade further. Ryukyu Sage, who was one of the few remaining experts after the Great War, came out without hesitation. He attacked the yin pearl to suppress it, but since it was a sovereign-level treasure, he should have been unable to suppress it with his strength. However, during the war, the yin sovereign pearl had suffered irreparable damage. It was the reason why it fell to the immortal realm and became a supreme immortal treasure. Because of this, Ryukyu Sage was able to suppress it with his strength and the world could recover. After that, Ryukyu Sage's name spread around the world at the speed of light, and the Yin Sovereign Pearl turned into Ryukyu Spirit Pearl. But Li Yunmu now learned that Ryukyu Sage coveted the Yin Sovereign Pearl rather than caring about the world. Otherwise, why would such a righteous person become so cruel and not even hesitate to use the vitality of youngsters to recover from his injuries? From that discovery, another thing came to make sense: why only those who had attained tribulation passing stage or higher level cultivation could enter the Yin Imperial Palace. It was because the soul refining spell could only absorb the cultivation of the past 100 years. Moreover, if the blood of someone whose cultivation wasn't sufficient entered the spell, it would reduce the quality of the spirit refining spell. Once Li Yunmu learned the aim of Ryukyu Sage, he didn't have the slightest intent to let the space-time spirits go. The black energy moved in his hand and instantly wrapped around the space-time spirits. When the space-time spirits saw the attack, they were extremely frightened and began to shout in incoherent voices. It was impossible to say whether they were crying or cursing. But Li Yunmu didn't feel the slightest bit of pity toward the little devils. He squeezed the energy using his hand, and the space-time spirits turned into a pile of flesh. Li Yunmu turned around then and left the great hall. He climbed up the stairs, and when he reached the final stair, the scene before his eyes changed. Could it all be an illusion? Everything in front of Li Yunmu's gaze became illusory. The walls around him and the path under his feet disappeared. He found himself floating in the void at that moment. Li Yunmu spread out his divine sense and began to investigate the place. After doing that, his frown deepened. He discovered that the place where he was standing wasn't an illusion, but rather a true void. Chapter 970, Real Soul of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Li Yunmu pondered it for some more time before understood what had happened. The final stair had to have been more than a simple stair. Instead, it was a teleport portal, which had transferred him to the void. But why? According to reason, there shouldn't be anyone in the world who could spread the information about the place to others, so why did the Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu prepare such a thing? Li Yunmu surveyed his surroundings, but nothingness covered everything. When he tried using his cultivation, he discovered that he could still use it, so what exactly was the purpose behind creating the Void Realm? The next second, Li Yunmu raised his guard because small light dots gathered in front of his eyes. They converged to form the figure of an awe-inspiring man. His features seemed to have been chiseled out of stone, with sharp edges and a grave appearance. He was clad in silver armor and had a blood-red cape fluttering behind him. He held a sword in his left hand and was carrying a pearl producing endless brilliance in his right hand. White light flickered in the man's eyes, and a powerful presence rushed to attack Li Yunmu. The man was probably the Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. When he looked at Li Yunmu, a powerful presence attacked him. It had the strength of a Heavenly Emperor, which suffocated Li Yunmu. Even the space surrounding him seemed to have frozen. Although Li Yunmu was powerful, he was only a great principal golden immortal. When confronted by a Heavenly Emperor, the pressure on him was so great that he couldn't breathe. His legs went soft, but he bit his lip and remained standing. Who was Li Yunmu? He was a person who had awakened the heart of a powerhouse by relying on himself, so how could he yield to something like pressure from those above him? Want to make me kneel? Impossible. Even heaven can't do that. Nor earth. It is impossible for a trifling remnant soul to do that. Li Yunmu released his full strength. His eyes went wide, and he clenched his teeth while resisting the presence of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Until then, Li Yunmu believed that even if he couldn't beat a Heavenly Emperor, if he staked his life, there was still a 50-50 chance. But the truth was that a Heavenly Emperor was much more frightening than what he thought. Just an attack from the presence had left Li Yunmu barely able to stand. If the opponent really attacked, how powerful would that be? But the enemy didn't seem to have the intent to attack. Instead, he curled his lips slightly to form a faintly discernible smile. Li Yunmu, in the meantime, was thinking of using dark energy to attack, but the next moment, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu pulled back his pressure. What's your name? An imposing voice echoed in Li Yunmu's mind. Li Yunmu was faintly startled and found himself unable to see through the Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. But he still kept his waist and back straight. Even if he confronted a Heavenly Emperor from ancient times, he didn't feel any dread. I am Li Yunmu, and you are Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu looked at Li Yunmu, and the admiration in his heart for the young man became even deeper. You surprisingly dare to be so arrogant in front of me. Aren't you afraid that I will kill you? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu asked Li Yunmu with a malevolent expression. You can't kill me. Li Yunmu said disdainfully. Although Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was much more powerful than him, he wouldn't die with the amount of trump cards he had. His shadow techniques put him in an invincible position. Haha, interesting little guy. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu suddenly began to smile. Seeing this, Li Yunmu became extremely suspicious. He couldn't understand the Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu in the slightest. What does this person want? And why did he appear in front of me? Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu seemed to have sensed Li Yunmu's suspicions, and he spoke up to explain himself. Actually, the one standing in front of you is my projection, my genuine residual soul. A question mark appeared on Li Yunmu's face. He couldn't understand the meaning of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's words and whether what he said was true or false. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's expression tightened as he continued. Within this Ryukyu spirit pearl, you can find another part of my soul, but that isn't my real residual soul. As for who it is, you should be clear about that in your heart. When Li Yunmu heard the words of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, how could he not know that the fake soul which Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was talking about belonged to the Yin Devil Sovereign? Then why did you appear here? Li Yunmu was extremely curious. If the one inside was Yin Devil Emperor, why would he let the soul of Heavenly Emperor stay here? In your words, it is because he is unable to kill me. After saying that, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu sighed. His words startled Li Yunmu, who couldn't understand the meaning of them. Why was he saying that Yin Devil Sovereign couldn't kill him? After the Great War concluded, many powerhouses perished, but I was lucky enough to survive, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu, recalling the past. He paused for a moment, then continued. When I learned that remnant effects of Yin Devil Sovereign's attack still existed and continued to endanger the world, I immediately set out. When I arrived here, I discovered that the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl was already damaged, otherwise, my strength wouldn't have been enough to subdue it. But you coveted strength. Do you think I'm an idiot and will believe those pleasant words? If you cared about this world so much, why did you set up that spirit refining formation below to slaughter the people of this world? Li Yunmu sneered. He didn't have any good impression of Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu sighed again and indifferently said, "Don't be hasty, and let me finish talking. My destined immortal weapon was destroyed while subduing the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl. Which do you think was more important for me among the two immortal weapons?" When Li Yunmu didn't speak up to answer, he continued. When I subdued the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl, it would be a lie to say that I didn't covet it at all. But in order to obtain a new immortal weapon, I am not so stupid that I would destroy my destined immortal weapon. Even if it was an even more formidable weapon, it couldn't compare to one's destined immortal weapon. Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu was among the frontrunners in terms of strength among all Heavenly Emperors, so he certainly wouldn't be stupid enough to give away something better for something worse. At that time, all the sovereigns had perished together with Yin Devil Sovereign, and the Emperor Realm powerhouses were injured. My wounds were pretty light, so only I could subdue the Yin Sovereign Pearl at that time, and it landed in my hands. I used my full strength to suppress it and prevent it from emitting the Yin energy. After Li Yunmu heard Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu's explanation, the hostility in his heart toward the man disappeared. Based on the historic records, Heavenly Emperor Ryukyu didn't use the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl but a large sword. After he obtained the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl, the large sword disappeared. If the story was to be believed, it was destroyed when subduing the Ryukyu Spirit Pearl.